parking outside. Where are the bodies? More of this room.
Latest research on test taking. Women
No.
scored better on tests in a warmer One item on the agenda today, it's looking at parking reductions and regulations for commercial uses. And I'll ask Jason to give us the presentation.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be back with y'all. So just a little bit of background. I'll go through this pretty quickly because some of it touches on some of the same points that we've discussed as a group before. But considering parking requirements, again, original motivation often to address concerns about spillover parking, and it involves some assumptions about the future of transportation that we'll continue to do it the same way that we've done it for a while, and we know that it's not always a safe assumption to make that assumption about any topic, and particularly transportation is one where there seem to be quite a few changes, whether it's transit investments that we're in the process of making in Raleigh or private companies that are starting to affect the way that we travel and think about traveling. So parking obviously provides a good and can address questions about spillover, concerns about spillover, but also can conflict with other goals. Housing affordability, employment opportunities in walkable or high transit areas, increased use of, or can conflict with increased use of transit and walking, or reducing vehicle miles traveled and carbon emissions. And a lot of this is because if more parking is being required than might otherwise have been provided, that raises the cost of the building, or that takes up space that a building could provide that would provide space for people to live or people to work. And then just walkability itself. Sometimes if you're walking in front of a lot of parking lots, typically not the most comfortable place. And stormwater runoff is another one, especially with surface lots, but really any kind of parking. So not going through all this about spillover, but just to set the stage that they are a tool for addressing spillover, but a fairly blunt one, usually applies across the board and only gets at that indirectly. The city's approach that is taken in recent years has been in areas where this is truly a documented problem, to be very responsive to residential neighborhoods that have experienced this, generally near large institutions, NC State or a hospital, or near, obviously, downtown, similar destinations that do generate a lot of parking. So can go through a process, designated areas, permit parking, and typically I think people have walked away from that process feeling pretty good, both on the commercial and the residential side. So just a quick refresher on the committee and where things stand with our discussion about parking. So some recommendations out recently related to residential parking, so treating the small apartments, the missing middle scale housing, more like we treat single family or detached houses, reducing parking for other multifamily units, and then particularly in high transit areas, the DX downtown district and the TOD overlay, further reducing parking under the understanding that those are areas where there are lots of options, plentiful options for traveling other than through a car. So the topic for today, the committee had requested from council the go-ahead to look at not just these residential requirements, which are part of a pending text change. And I would note that staff has been holding those just briefly because some of these potential commercial changes would touch the exact same code sections. So rather than rewrite that twice or go through a potentially confusing process, lump them together, whatever the final recommendations are, and proceed with that text change. So today, talking about non-residential parking requirements, downtown specifically, also near transit, And then finally, thinking about for projects that tend to provide a very high level of parking, there's two approaches to that. One has been to put in a hard cap, a maximum. Another one, which the committee expressed some interest in exploring, was rather than just absolutely cap it, look at some strategies for perhaps discouraging, but also mitigating some of those specific negative impacts, stormwater runoff, et cetera, for those types of projects. So a little bit of research about what our peer cities are doing, and so looked at some cities both in North Carolina and across the country, pretty comparable. So Charlotte, Winston-Salem, and Durham, they're lumped together, not to add one more hyphen to Winston-Salem, but because they, in a few cases, had identical requirements. Austin, Texas, Columbus, Ohio, Richmond, Virginia, which just implemented or has begun to implement their bus rapid transit downtown. So this is looking just at downtown parking requirements. So Raleigh and Charlotte, the two outliers from this group that do require parking for commercial uses. Raleigh does lessen that in the downtown district. No spaces for the first 10,000 square feet, and then 2 per 1,000 after that. And I'm going to try to avoid getting to a whole lot of parking ratio numbers, but there's a few here and there that I'll mention as we go through. So Charlotte has a little bit of a larger allowance for downtown parking before it's required, and then requires less than does the city of Raleigh after that, although it scales up as buildings get larger, but up to 200,000 square feet, pretty substantial building, much less than Raleigh's. And then the other cities don't have a requirement. So just now, that doesn't mean that parking isn't provided. I'm sure in almost every case it is. But rather than being driven by the code, being driven by what these individual buildings feel like they need in order to provide parking for their employees. In this case, since we're talking about commercial requirements or visitors, customers. So also did a little bit of discussions with some of these cities and with the DRA, Downtown Raleigh Alliance, get a sense of what some of the experiences have been and stakeholders feel like. So one thing I would note is that increasingly cities have been reducing these or eliminating these requirements. To my knowledge, none have turned around after doing that and increased them or reinstated them. They have not had that experience that it has backfired in some way. Specific conversations with Durham and Winston-Salem. Durham probably a little bit more comparable to us than Winston-Salem, but no negative feedback that they had received. Did have a perception, probably this is something that y'all hear too, that it's really tough to find parking, but that perception doesn't necessarily match the reality. It may not be exactly in front of you exactly when you want it, but that it does exist. So some of this is about wayfinding and just making it easier to locate the parking that is there. So we did do some outreach to DRA, and they want to share these questions or make sure that they have the input that they feel like they need with their stakeholders. So they did say that perception exists, that inventory is low. They wanted to make sure that they got some good feedback before they took some defined stance on some of these recommendations. One question was about shared parking. And so different ways you can share parking. One would be a project that shares parking between different uses, and that's definitely allowed by code. Not all projects take advantage of that. So speaking with our parking staff, I understand that sometimes we have projects that are residential and the deck is nearly empty during the day. They have not shared that and don't have didn't install the infrastructure to allow them to do that more easily. And so that's a bit of a frustration that we weren't able to help them maximize their investment. But that's definitely something encouraged by code. And I know that the city does do outreach with new projects to encourage them to share parking and take advantage of that asset. Also, possibility of shared parking in terms of someone signing a lease with the city for a city facility. And again, had some discussions with parking staff about that, and they felt like that would have a benefit in terms of opening up, rather than one specific garage that you would have to go to, a little bit more flexibility, but the downside would be some additional uncertainty about finding that space, and that some locations, some garages in certain locations would likely fill up faster, and then you would have customers who are a little frustrated or have to circle to find a spot, which is not what ideally we want people to do.
So we don't have the ability to do shared by deck? In other words, shared but only within one deck. So whatever the sharing was going on, they wouldn't have to worry about this one deck filling up and having to go hunt in a different deck. Is
Right, that
that
was,
a DRA question?
that's probably something that they would have some feedback on, if they feel like that would be desirable or not. But yes, the feedback that I got was that if you let people potentially share one deck rather than having their own designated deck, that it would potentially result in that deck filling up early and then not having that certainty. There's some value in that certainty of knowing that your space would be there. And you can pay extra for that.
Okay. So is our new parking app going to have the ability to tell you where the spaces are? So you would already know before you hit downtown that that deck is full and you need to go to the next one?
Not for a lease, but just for coming downtown to
Yeah,
find a
just
spot.
spaces, open spaces in this deck, 0, 50.
Right. That's a good question. I want to say yes, but I don't know the specifics of that. That's certainly something that we can check with parking staff about and have a better understanding of how technology is helping connect people to the parking spaces, which is part of using that asset efficiently.
I guess in some cities, as you're coming in on the highway, they have a sign that has all the decks listed and it tells you how many spaces are available in each deck. It seems like we're sort of moved on to more of the mobile technology so you can ask Siri while you're driving.
And for on-street parking as well, some cities have developed resources or private resources have been generated that allow people to identify on-street spaces as well.
So the whole question of shared parking really might require some more information about technologies that are available.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to have some additional conversations with parking staff and understand what it does exist now in terms of those resources and what might in the future.
Okay. Yeah.
So getting to options then for downtown, and one option would be to wait until we do get a little bit more direct feedback from DRA, pretty reasonable option. But in the broader sense, a couple of basic options that could be approached. One would be to follow lead of some of the other cities that we looked at and remove parking entirely, commercial requirements entirely downtown. Again, making a distinction between requirements and actual parking provision. The second would be something a little bit more modest and possibly looking to Charlotte as an example. So they have reduced but not eliminated their requirement. And so that would be a fairly reasonable option. Increasingly, Raleigh with the BRT provision is becoming a closer peer of Charlotte, I think, in terms of transit provision. And then more broadly than that, pretty closely similar in terms of overall scale of the city and forms of commuting. So a fairly good comparison, I think. So, and I'll go back at the end and summarize again all the options.
So option 3 in that slide would be get more feedback from DRA.
That's right.
Okay.
So also took a look again at the committee's direction at some requirements near, commercial parking requirements near transit-rich areas. So this is again that same peer city review. A little bit more variation there in terms of what's required. And I would also distinguish when it comes to the city of Raleigh between a couple different categories in terms of how we look at this. So one would be existing code provision for a 10% reduction near frequent transit, 15 minutes or less during peak periods and runs throughout the day. So that would be your standard bus service as long as it's on a frequent line. And so the provision there would be a 10%, fairly modest reduction, 10% reduction. The second would be the TOD overlay, which exists but hasn't been actually applied to the ground anywhere yet. And so that would go in places where the level of transit is much higher than just the frequent network, where there's essentially the bus rapid transit corridors would be the likeliest place to apply that, and where that higher level of bus service would encourage, well, more trips on transit and justify a larger reduction So the committee looked at that area in terms of residential parking. This would be for commercial parking. Right now, it doesn't, it's similar for the requirement for downtown. None for the first 10,000 square feet and then 2 per 1,000 after that. So comparing to the other cities, this largely tracks, I think, the level of transit provision they have in these cities. So Columbus, fairly robust bus network, but nothing beyond that. Don't offer any reduction. Winston-Salem, a small reduction near transit stops. Austin, some reduction, but not any, well, 60% of the minimum is not nothing, but it's not as dramatic as reducing or eliminating them entirely. And then a couple of cities, again, to the extent you would consider these a peer, Charlotte and Richmond, they don't have any minimums in their TOD overlay. And so some considerations here, thinking about the level of transit is pretty important. That's going to drive how many people use the transit and the parking demand. But of course, also the more parking we require, that also tends to, that's something that shapes how people travel as well, something to keep in mind. So our current approach, which I noted on the previous slide, is that small reduction, but a larger one that hasn't been applied to the TOD overlay. One thing I want to note particularly is that a planning process that we had been calling BRT framework, that's planning around the transit, the BRT facilities. We're now calling that equitable development around transit. That's a process that speaks much more to the intent of that plan. That's going to kick off in just a couple weeks. Actually, at the Convention Center, first event will take place June the 6th. That's next Thursday. And that is all about considering a couple of core questions. One would be, given that we know that the city of Raleigh, with the opportunity here and the quality of life here, people will be moving here, and people who live here now will be deciding to stay here, and their children will be deciding to stay here. We know that there's going to be substantial population growth in the coming decades. So thinking about what percentage of that growth would be reasonable to accommodate along these BRT corridors. And then the second big question, or equally big question, is we also know affordability is a challenge along these corridors. So thinking really hard about what that looks like for folks in these areas and arriving at some goals for housing affordability in the city of Raleigh. Those are the two big picture topics that that plan wants to address. There's also some tools, though, and some of those tools would include tools for affordability, tools for zoning, but specifically would consider parking. That's a big part of what makes transit areas work or sometimes not work. So that process will consider parking requirements in the TOD overlay for commercial parking. So one approach would be to let that, take a closer look at that, and then for that larger parking reduction in the TOD overlay, that could have some suggestions or recommendations at the end of that process. So I kind of actually outlined in that previous slide the two basic options, but one would be looking at that, just the frequent bus network reduction, which already exists, 10% for those properties near frequent transit, possibly reducing that further if that's the desire of the committee and council. 25% is not out of line with some of the other communities, City of Austin. And also possibly considering expanding that exemption to a more moderate frequency in bus service. Now that depends on, again, both how likely you think it is that people living near those or working near those areas would take advantage of the transit, but also, again, recognizing that decisions about parking shape decisions about travel. The second possible, and this could be in addition to that other recommendation, allowing that process, the equitable development process, to play out and look specifically at the TOD overlay and whether some additional adjustments might be warranted there.
So on this slide, so the equitable development process will not include analysis of potential parking reductions outside of the TOD overlay.
It is focused just along those BRT corridors.
Okay.
So almost by definition, those would be the areas that the TOD overlay
Right.
would likely be applied to.
Okay, so if we looked at first option for frequent transit or moderate transit, medium frequency service, that wouldn't be a duplication of anything that happened An equitable development
That's
process.
right. So it wouldn't duplicate that. That really would apply to areas outside that, because ultimately, equitable development and the application of that TOD overlay would provide a much larger reduction
Okay,
than would that.
So now here comes a
reduction.
question that, apologize, we've divided this up into residential and non-residential, but where I understand the memo, you're saying we're sort of holding back on the residential because they are interrelated and maybe it makes sense. So I'll bring it up. For affordable housing units, by some definition, some standard, it seems like those would be a great candidate for steeply reducing the parking or near frequent transit. And then, of course, we could have the same conversation inside the TODs, but I'm wondering, is the idea of reducing parking for affordable units part of the conversation today?
It can be. It wasn't part of the memo, but that is another actually provision that does currently exist in the code, but could be potentially expanded.
Yeah, I think we would need to be careful about that, though, because I wouldn't want to be penalizing people who live in affordable housing by giving them something less than what other folks would have in terms of parking availability.
Well, of course, the idea is to reduce the cost of the rental by not tacking on the cost of a parking space, but I guess it would be up to the affordable housing developer whether they did or did not feel like providing it was going to be a reasonable necessity for the people in the affordable housing. Obviously, the synergy of having housing along a transit line is to not have to own a car, not have to have a parking space, and to be able to take transit. And so at some point, we're going to have to start preferring one mode and to achieve a range of goals over the other. So,
yeah, it's not an easy thing to balance out, but I think, I just think we need to make sure that we're being fair to everybody when we do that.
well, again, I don't know that we have, I guess on our typical, what are our transit reductions now for affordable housing? Near frequent transit reductions that we offer for affordable units.
I look to Ken to correct me if I happen to be wrong on this, but I believe it's 10%. And I don't believe that also applies in addition to other reductions.
Does or does not?
Does not.
Does not. So the other reductions would be as a result of a frontage or something?
That's right. Frontage or the existing reduction, the 10% on the slide for properties that are near frequent transit.
Okay, well, maybe.
Or
then
downtown properties.
Okay, so maybe I'll just let the more transit-rich environment case of TOD overlay be the one where we let them look at the context in more detail. So anyway, okay, thanks.
And then the last topic was one that the committee expressed some desire in exploring a little bit more. The idea of a maximum or some other way, maybe a softer way of achieving a maximum. So the idea traditionally has been that parking is a good thing, which it certainly can be, but that more parking is always better, which isn't necessarily the case. And a clearer understanding, I think, has developed over time of some of those negatives, and that's what our current code actually recognizes, and some other cities as well. So actually, if you look at the bottom here, this is what's currently in the UDO. So any project that comes forward to a site plan and is providing parking beyond the minimum by 150%. So if the minimum requirement, whatever the use related to the size, let's say it's 100 spaces. If they're proposing to provide 160 spaces, then they would have to mitigate the difference beyond 150, which in some cases that would be fairly small. But there's a couple of specific strategies that can be used to do that. So one is additional stormwater detention. One is solar arrays over some of that additional parking. Also the design of the lots themselves, additional tree or landscaped islands, or a 5% increase on the site elsewhere in terms of tree conservation. So what we've found, though, in looking at how that strategy has played out is there have not been very many projects that fell into that category of 150% plus. In fact, only a handful since those rules were put in place. So it's not currently doing that much in terms of affecting the design of how parking is provided. So did look at some other cities and how they approach the same question. And just as an example, City of Durham, they actually created it by different tiers of the city. They have what they call downtown or compact neighborhoods, which is the older historic core of Durham. And in those areas, it's a fairly low maximum. And if a project proposes to exceed that maximum, then additional parking must be pervious or in a structure or underground. Essentially not a large surface lot unless it's pervious. Now, in some other parts of the city, they have a higher maximum. But so where that led some potential options for this question would be to reduce that 150% because it simply isn't catching very many projects. Reduce that and had some conversations with our stormwater staff about a reasonable number, and 110% they were comfortable with. And in terms of specific mitigation measures, they felt in general like some suite of green infrastructure strategies would be appropriate. So something that, again, there's a nexus between the issue and the regulation. And so they would propose to develop a couple of categories that would be, to some extent, an applicant's choice as to how they could mitigate that additional level of impervious surface. So the suggestions there would be to, again, lower that maximum, not all the way down to the minimum, but a relatively small gap before there started to be some requirement for some additional mitigation, and then make that mitigation more specific. So all this is, it looks like a lot, but it's just summarizing what we went through today. So talked about the downtown, potential changes to those requirements, waiting for some feedback from DRA, talked about transit, the possibility for making some adjustments to the high frequency transit reduction, possibly waiting on the equitable development process to consider TOD parking requirements, and then mitigation for projects for high levels of parking, couple options there. So with that, happy to take questions that y'all might have.
Great.
So for the downtown parking requirements for option number 1, what I saw in the presentation was that there aren't really any negatives to getting rid of parking requirements by the city because builders and developers and banks are going to require those properties to build parking anyway. So am I getting that wrong, or it seems to be more of a perception that as a city does not require parking?
I think there's some perception. I do think it would be helpful to hear the perspective of DRA and some of the stakeholders that they work with. But yes, I agree. Looking at it from a city policy level, it's hard to see a large downside to that.
Okay.
Parking will still continue to be provided. If there are some issues with spillover parking, then there's some other tools that address that, probably in a better, clearer way than mandating that parking be provided for people who may not use it.
Right. And I know there's some conversation about park and ride anyway, so I think that's interesting. And then on the additional mitigation projects, if we go down to 110%, or something around there, what kind of projects are we usually talking about? You said there was about a handful for the 150. Is that like the big box retail stores? Is that apartment complexes? What are we talking about?
I think it's more likely that there have been so few that it's hard to characterize them that broadly. And we didn't do study of what would be 100, if it was 120%, what would that would take a little bit more staff time to look at. But I would suspect, yes, that the retail projects would be likely to have a fairly high number.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, to me, getting some more input from DRA on the downtown issue, I think is appropriate. And for the one in the middle, I kind of like the idea of the equitable development process and understanding what's happening there. Yeah.
So on
Agree.
the second one, it is kind of broken up into two parts.
Right.
Equity development is going to look at the TOD overlay, but the first bullet will not be part of their discussion, right?
That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
So
Equitable
that's kind of two
development will
different-
just be looking at those areas along BRT. So there are many frequent routes that extend across the city that would not be part of that study.
Okay, so, and so my sense of the first one, we'll hold that item here and get feedback from DRA. For the second one, it sounds like we can, the second bullet, we'll just report out and let equitable development process deal with that. The first bullet, maybe it is on us to pick a number, maybe 25%. I'm not quite ready to go for medium frequency service yet, but certainly on frequent transit, I think there's more potential that people will develop projects with fewer parking built into them if they're near frequent transit. Hopefully medium frequency service will become high frequency at some time in the future, and they would be picked up that way.
Right.
So, and then on the last one, I'm wondering if that question about the threshold and the mitigation techniques might be one that we would just send a smack and let them bring it back to full council. That all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna, for downtown parking requirements for non-residential use, I'm gonna recommend that we send that item to DRA and have them bring their findings back to us. For the second one, I'm going, for the first bullet, which is parking reductions near frequent transit, but not in TOD overlays, that we recommend to council a 25% reduction for, again, high-frequency service, and don't do anything with medium-frequency service right now. And then for parking reductions in the TOD overlays, I recommend that we just report that out as an item to be taken up by the equitable development process. And then for the final item relating to the threshold and the mitigation methods, that we report that out with a recommendation that it gets sent to SMAC and then comes back to the full council.
If that's a motion, I'll
That's the
second it.
motion. Okay. All right, and more discussion?
Clarification on number one.
Yep.
Is DRA coming back here to the committee or?
Yes.
Okay.
Just that one. Everything else is not coming back to us.
So technically, we could simply holding this part in committee.
Right.
Right. The rest, the other two are gonna report out.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so any more discussion?
No, I'm comfortable.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Passed unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Meeting adjourned.
Oh.
And Nancy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Before we adjourn, our committee member, Mayor McFarland, is excused. Now we're adjourned. Thank you.
You're getting better and better, Russ.
With a little help.